The woodpile was almost gone. Ruth Callahan stood at the kitchen window and counted what remained, the way she had once counted a patient's pulse, steady and without hope of a different answer. 14 logs, maybe 15 if she included the split pieces stacked against the lower half of the barn wall, the ones that had gotten wet in November and still had not fully dried. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the porch post read 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky above the Bitterroot Range had gone the color of old pewter flat, and close and pressing down on the valley like a lid. 1 year. She had been a widow for 1 year and 3 weeks, and she was still surprised each morning by the silence on the other side of the bed. Gerald Callahan had been a large man, not tall but substantial. The kind of man who filled a room without trying, whose breathing in sleep had been so steady and deep that Ruth had sometimes lain awake just to listen to it, the way you might listen to a river at night, finding in its constancy a kind of peace. He had died of pneumonia in the second week of January, in the bed they had shared for 31 years, in the house he had built with his brother Warren, before the brothers stopped being the kind of men who could build things together. The county doctor had come up the mountain road and said what doctors say when they have no better options. Ruth had held Gerald's hand and done what nurses do, which is to stay present in the body, even when the spirit wants to leave the room. She had been a nurse for 30 years. She knew how to hold a hand and feel the moment when the hand stops holding back. What she had not known how to do was everything that came after. She turned from the window. Behind her at the kitchen table, Cora Callahan sat with a sock stretched over a wooden darning egg, her needle moving in small, precise arcs. Cora was 82 years old and had been Gerald's mother before she became Ruth's, which was a distinction that had mattered once and no longer did. She had knuckles the size of small walnuts from 40 years of Montana winters, and she wore 2 pairs of wool socks, even inside the house, and had not complained about the cold once in the 12 months since Gerald died, which Ruth understood was its own kind of complaint. The road into the valley had been blocked since the 4th of December, not snowed, in which happened every winter and could be managed, but buried under a section of mountain that had decided to move. The avalanche had come down on the south-facing slope above the logging road at 3 in the morning, and Ruth had heard it from her bed, a sound like distant thunder that went on too long. By morning, when she had snowshoed out to look, there was nothing to see but a new hillside, where the road had been smooth and white and permanent. The Forest Service would come in the spring with equipment. Until then, the valley held its 2 remaining residents the way a fist holds something it is not ready to release. Her nearest neighbor was Silas Pruitt, 3 miles up the mountain, a man of 70 who ran a trap line and came down to trade venison and hides twice a season. Beyond that, there was no one until the town of Harlow, 14 miles away and entirely unreachable. Ruth had a battery-powered radio that received weather transmissions and a cell phone that received nothing at all in the valley, which she kept in a kitchen drawer, because holding it made her feel less alone, even when it was useless. There was no landline. Gerald had always meant to run one up from the junction box at the base of the mountain road. He had always meant to do a great many things. Ruth moved to the stove and added one of the 14 logs to the fire, listening to the wood catch. She was 64 years old and had spent the better part of those years moving toward things rather than away from them. She had driven an hour each way to her nursing shifts at the county hospital in Harlow for 19 years. She had raised 2 children who now lived in cities she visited twice a year. She had kept this house, this land, this life on the mountain because Gerald had loved it, and then because she had come to love it herself, and now because it was the last place that still had his shape in it. The dent in the couch where he sat, the shelf where he kept his coffee mug, The worn spot on the porch rail where he rested his elbows in the evening and looked out at the valley with the expression of a man who could not believe his luck. The land had a creek. That was the thing about it. A spring-fed creek that ran cold and clear year-round, fed from somewhere deep in the mountain. Never freezing even in January, never running low even in August. Gerald had known the way some people know things about the places they love, that the creek was why the land was worth having. The water rights attached to the property were senior rights recorded in 1947 by Gerald's father, which meant in plain language that no downstream claim could touch them, and that any development depending on that water would have to come to whoever owned this land first. Vernon Holt had wanted those water rights for 11 years. Vernon was Gerald's older brother by 4 years, and a man who had turned the family's original homestead into something that looked like prosperity from the outside. 800 acres, a herd of Herefords, a new truck every 3 years. A wife who had left him in 2019 and whom he mentioned with the flat effect of a man discussing a business arrangement that had not worked out. He was 58 years old and ran his operation with a thoroughness that Ruth had once mistaken for competence and now understood was simply appetite. Vernon wanted things, and he pursued what he wanted with the patience of a man who had learned that most obstacles eventually moved if you simply waited long enough and applied pressure at the right moments. Gerald's death had been for Vernon the right moment. He had come to the house 3 days before the avalanche, which meant he had arrived when the road was still passable, which meant he had been watching the weather and had chosen his timing the way a man chooses when to swing an axe. He had knocked at the door at 2 in the afternoon when the light was already failing, and he had stood in the kitchen with his good wool coat and his clean boots and the expression of a man performing concern, and he had told Ruth that he was worried about her. She had offered him coffee. She was a woman who had been trained since childhood to offer things. He had sat across from her at the same table where Cora was now darning her sock, and he had talked for 20 minutes about the difficulty of her situation before arriving at the reason for his visit, which was that he wanted to purchase the property, the house, the 40 acres, the creek and the water rights attached to it. He had with him a figure written on a piece of paper, which he had slid across the table to her face down, as though the number on the other side required some preparation to receive. Ruth had turned the paper over. $200. She had looked at the number for a long time. She had looked at it the way you look at something that requires your brain to recalibrate, because what you are seeing does not match what you expected to see. $200 was less than she spent on groceries in a month. It was less than the property tax bill she had paid in September. It was, she knew with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent 3 decades dealing in numbers that mattered about 1/100th of what the water rights alone were worth to any developer with a project in the valley. This is a kindness, Vernon had said, not a business proposition. You are a widow alone on a mountain with an old woman to look after, and winter is coming. I am offering you a way out. She had folded the paper. She had told him no. He had nodded slowly the way men nod when they have expected a refusal and find it confirms rather than surprises them. He had told her that the storm coming down from Canada was the worst in 40 years according to the Weather Service. He had told her that his lawyer in Harlow had reviewed Gerald's estate and found some irregularities in the debt structure that would need to be addressed in spring. He had told her he would be in touch. Then he had put on his good coat and gone back out to his truck and driven down the mountain road before it closed. 2 days later, the mountain had come down on the road. Ruth did not think this was a coincidence. Vernon Holt was a man who watched things carefully. She sat down now at the kitchen table across from Cora and did not pick up anything to do with her hands, which was unusual. Ruth was a woman who was always doing something with her hands. 30 years of nursing had made her this way. When there was nothing useful to do, you did the next useful thing, and when there was no next useful thing, you prepared for the one after that. Stillness felt to Ruth like failure, the way it feels to a person who has been moving all their life when the movement finally stops. But tonight she sat still and her hands lay flat on the table, and she looked at nothing in particular. Cora looked up from her darning. She did not say anything. She was a woman who understood the difference between a silence that wanted to be broken and one that needed to be held. After a while, Ruth got up and went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept the household papers. She took out a sheet of paper and a pen. She sat down at the desk. She stared at the blank sheet for a long time. The paper stayed blank. She was thinking about what a letter to Vernon would look like, what the words would feel like in her mouth. The relief of it, which was what she kept returning to, the simple animal relief of not having to wake up tomorrow and face another day of counting logs and watching the sky and calculating how many weeks were left before the road might open. She was 64 years old, and she was tired in a way she had not been tired before. A tiredness that was not in her muscles but somewhere deeper, somewhere that sleep did not reach. She picked up the pen. She held it above the paper. She did not write anything. What came to her instead was Gerald's voice, not a memory exactly, but something closer to a presence the way the dead sometimes return, not in visions but in the sudden certainty of what they would say if they could speak. Gerald had stood on this porch 100 times in the evenings, his elbows on that worn rail looking out at the valley in the fading light. And he had said it enough times that it had become a kind of prayer. A thing you said when the beauty of a place was too large for ordinary language. This land is keeping something. I do not know what it is yet. Ruth set down the pen. She sat for another few minutes in the dim room with Gerald's words in her chest, feeling them the way you feel a cold that has not gone cold. Then she folded the blank sheet of paper, put it back in the desk drawer, and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she slept. In the morning, the sky was the color of bone, and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees in the night. Ruth built up the fire with 2 of the remaining logs and stood over it longer than was practical, warming her hands while the kitchen slowly came up to a temperature that could be called livable. Cora appeared in her doorway, already dressed, already wearing both pairs of socks, and looked at the fire, and then at Ruth, and then at the woodpile through the window. She did not say what they were both thinking. She went to the stove and put on water for coffee. They ate in the way they had been eating since November, which was carefully. Oatmeal with dried fruit from the mason jars lined up in the pantry. Half a piece of toast each. The eggs from the 4 hens that had survived the winter were rationed to every other morning. Ruth ate without tasting. She was doing the math she always did now, the calculations that had replaced the ordinary thoughts of ordinary mornings. 14 logs. No, 13 now. Estimated days until the road might be cleared, which depended on weather, which was unpredictable. Estimated days of food remaining at current consumption. Estimated temperature drop if they went without heat for any significant period. The math did not resolve to anything hopeful. After breakfast, Ruth put on her layers, long underwear, wool pants, a flannel shirt, a heavy sweater, the insulated canvas work coat she had bought in Harlow 3 years ago, that was starting to show wear at the elbows. She pulled on her wool hat, her insulated gloves. She picked up the hand axe from beside the back door. Cora watched this process from her chair. Ruth said, "I'm going up to the north face. There may be standing dead timber near the ridge. I saw it from the porch last spring, but I never went up to check." Cora looked at her. Then she looked at the window. The north face of the mountain rose steeply behind the property, a slope of granite and lodgepole pine that Ruth had climbed dozens of times in summer and almost never in winter. Her knees, Cora said. Ruth looked at her. Cora said, "My knees will not manage that slope today." Ruth nodded. She had known this before she said it. She had said it anyway because the alternative was to say nothing, and saying nothing felt like admitting that there was no plan. "I will be back before dark," Ruth said. "Keep the fire going at low, one log at a time." She went out the back door before Cora could say anything else. The cold outside the house was a different animal from the cold inside it. Inside the cold was a presence, something that could be managed, pushed back with wool and fire. Outside it was the environment itself, total and indifferent, the natural state of things. Ruth's breath came out in thick clouds that dispersed immediately in the dry air. Her boots crunched on the packed snow. Above her the mountain rose in its winter silence, the pines dark against the pale sky, the granite faces of the upper ridge showing through where the wind had scoured the snow away. She had been a nurse. She was practical about her body and its capabilities. She knew that a 64-year-old woman climbing a mountain slope in winter with an axe was not a heroic undertaking, but a necessary one, and that the difference between necessary and reckless was preparation. She had her emergency kit in the canvas bag on her back. Water matches a small foil emergency blanket, a length of parachute cord, a folding knife. She had told Cora where she was going. These were the habits of a lifetime in rural medicine. She climbed. The slope behind the house rose gradually for the first quarter mile before tilting up more sharply toward the ridge. In summer, this was 40 minutes of pleasant walking. In winter, with 2 feet of packed snow, it was something else. Ruth moved methodically, testing each step, using the axe handle as a staff where the angle steepened. Her thighs burned. Her breathing came hard and steady. She found a rhythm and held it. The timber on the lower slope was all living pine, tall and dark and useless for the axe. She had known this. She had been hoping for the dead stands she had seen from below in May-gray trunks, without bark, already seasoned by sun and wind. She pushed up toward where she had seen them, her boots punching through the top crust of snow with each step. She found nothing. The dead timber, she remembered, was not there, or was buried or had been taken down by the wind at some point in the summer, and was now under the snow somewhere invisible and unreachable. She stood at the edge of a granite outcrop and looked out over the valley below her chest, heaving the cold air burning in her lungs. And she allowed herself to feel for exactly 1 minute the full weight of where she was. 64 years old, alone on a mountain in a winter that was not finished with 13 logs and a $200 insult, and a road that would not open until April. She allowed herself to feel it. Then she exhaled, watched the cloud of her breath dissolve into the pale air, and turned to look for another way. The rock face of the ridge ran east to west along the upper edge of the property, a wall of gray granite that had always marked the boundary of the land Gerald loved. In summer, Ruth had sometimes walked along its base, following the line of the rock in the cool shadow, finding in it the particular pleasure of a thing that had been there for longer than human understanding could reach. She moved that way now, following the base of the cliff more out of habit than intention, letting her feet find the path, because her mind had no better suggestion. The wind had dropped. The valley below was silent. She could hear her own breathing and the occasional tick of a pine branch releasing snow somewhere above her. She was not thinking about the story Cora had told her. She was thinking about the math of 13 logs and a road that would not open until April, and about the blank piece of paper on the desk, and about what Gerald's voice had sounded like when he said this. Land is keeping something, the particular quality of certainty in it. The way a man sounds when he is saying something he has tested enough times in his own mind to be willing to say aloud. She reached out to steady herself against the rock face and stopped walking. She stood completely still. Her gloved hand was pressed flat against the granite. She lifted the hand and looked at the glove. Then she pressed it back against the stone, moving it slowly, covering more surface. She took off the glove. She pressed her bare palm flat against the rock. The granite should have been the coldest thing on the mountain. Stone in winter holds cold the way it holds nothing else, absorbing it from the air and the ground and the sky and giving nothing back. She had pressed her hands against 1,000 pieces of rock in her life and knew what they felt like against bare skin. This did not feel like that. It was not warm, not in any ordinary sense, not like touching a heated surface or standing near a fire. It was the absence of cold. A small, precise region of the cliff face where the stone was not the temperature it should have been, where something was happening inside the mountain that made the surface, against all reason, refuse the cold. Ruth moved her hand across the rock, slowly mapping the boundary of it. The place where the stone went from ordinary winter cold to this other thing. The region was roughly the size of a door, and at the lower left edge of it, near the base of the cliff where the stone met the frozen ground, she found a narrow gap, a fissure in the rock no wider than her hand, running vertically from the base of the cliff upward for perhaps 3 feet. From this gap, so faint she would have missed it if she had not been standing still and paying attention, in the way that 30 years of nursing had trained her. To pay attention, there came a current of air. It was not cold air. Ruth crouched down and brought her face close to the fissure and felt the current on her cheek. She closed her eyes. The air that came from the gap smelled of deep stone, of dry earth, of something old and mineral and dark. Not the air of the surface world. The air of somewhere else. Somewhere that the winter had not reached. She sat back on her heels and looked at the rock face for a long time. She thought about what Cora had told her the night before. The story Cora's grandmother had passed down from her own grandmother from the winter of 1918, when the cold had come down from Canada and stayed for 3 months. And the people in the valley had begun to lose things, cattle first, then children, then hope. A man had followed a fox into the high rocks one day and had found a place in the mountain where the air was not cold, where the stone itself was breathing something warmer than the world outside. The people had thought it was magic. The man had known it was the earth keeping something alive. Ruth had listened to this story the way she listened to most old stories, with the respectful attention of a practical person who does not want to be rude about something that is not provable. She had thought kindly and privately that grief did this to old women sometimes, made them reach for the stories that had comforted their grandmothers, found in the old words a warmth that the present could not offer. She had not thought about the story again after that. Until now. She stood up slowly. She looked up the cliff face, following the line of the fissure where it ran upward through the stone. Above the gap, she could see that the rock was cracked in several places. Old cracks that had been there since before any living person's memory. The result of 1,000 freeze-thaw cycles, working on the stone over centuries. From one of these higher cracks, she noticed a thin trace of moisture on the rock face, a streak of dampness in an otherwise dry stone wall. Not ice, damp, as though the rock had been breathing something wet and warm from the inside. Ruth took a step back and looked at the full face of the cliff. She was a nurse. She was not a geologist, not a naturalist, not a person trained to understand what she was seeing. But she was a woman who had spent 64 years paying careful attention to things. And what she was seeing was a mountain that was warmer on the inside than the air outside it, and a gap at its base that was both narrow enough to be missed and wide enough, if made wider, to become something else. She put her glove back on. She looked at the fissure for another long moment. then looked at the valley below, then at the sky to the north where the clouds had thickened during the time she had been on the mountain, and were now the specific shade of blue-gray that the old-timers in Harlow called a hard sky, which meant a sky that was about to become something worse than clouds. The storm that Vernon Holt had mentioned. The worst in 40 years. Ruth picked up the axe and turned back down the mountain. She moved faster than she had coming up, not quite running her feet. Finding the packed snow by instinct. Her mind already ahead of her body, already in the kitchen, already looking at Cora across the table. She went through the back door without stopping to knock the snow off her boots, which she never did, which told Cora everything before Ruth said a word. Cora looked up from her chair. Ruth crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and crouched down in front of Cora's chair and looked at the old woman's face. Cora's expression did not change, but her eyes, which were still Gerald's eyes, in the way that certain things persist through generations, sharpened in the way of a woman who has been waiting for something without knowing what it was. Ruth said the story your grandmother told you. The man who followed the fox. The place in the mountain where the air was warm. Cora was still. I need you to tell it to me again, Ruth said. Every detail. Everything you remember. The wind had begun to rise outside. Ruth could hear it finding the corners of the house, testing the eaves, beginning its long work. The fire in the stove popped once, and the last of the daylight moved against the kitchen window like something being folded away. Cora set down her darning. She looked at Ruth for a moment with those sharp, familiar eyes. Then she said, "Sit down." Ruth sat. Cora began to speak. She spoke slowly the way old women speak when they are drawing from a deep place, when the words must be brought up carefully, so that nothing important is lost in the bringing. She spoke about her grandmother, a woman named Ida, who had lived to 93 and had kept her mind until the end, which Cora considered both a blessing and a duty, the duty being to remember the things worth remembering and to pass them on to the people who needed them. The winter of 1918, Cora said, was not just cold. It was a different kind of cold. A cold that came with intention, that seemed to know which things mattered, and went for them first. The creek in the valley froze for the first time in living memory. 3 families lost their livestock in the first 2 weeks. A family named Hartley lost a child. People began to talk about leaving, which in those years and in that place was a kind of death sentence of its own, because leaving meant admitting that the land had won. Ida's father was a man called August, and August was the kind of man who did not accept the premise that the land was something to be defeated, or to which one could lose. He understood the land as something alive, something with its own systems and purposes. And he believed that if you paid close enough attention to what the land was doing, it would show you what it was trying to keep us. He had been watching the animals. Specifically, he had been watching a red fox that appeared each morning at the base of the high ridge, always approaching the cliff. From the same angle, always disappearing into the rocks. At the same point, always emerging an hour later and trotting back down the mountain with the particular unbothered ease of an animal that has been somewhere comfortable. August followed the fox one morning in the teeth of a January wind. He went to the place in the cliff where the fox had disappeared. He found a gap in the stone, a fissure at the base of the rock face, narrow but deep. And from that gap came air that was not cold. He widened the gap over 3 days using iron tools in his own bare hands, where the tools would not fit. Inside the fissure was a chamber, a natural space in the rock no bigger than a room where the stone floor radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. and everything to do with what the earth keeps in its deep places. He brought his family to this chamber when the storm of 1918 came down. They survived. Cora stopped speaking. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was no longer testing the house, but had committed to it. A steady voice that found every gap and spoke through it. Ruth sat with this for a moment. She sat the way she had learned to sit with difficult information in her years of nursing fully present, with it not trying to resolve it or explain it away, but simply allowing it to be what it was. Then she said, "Where on the cliff?" Cora looked at her. "Base of the rock face," Ruth said. "East side. Where the stone runs in a long line and the granite face goes up about 30 feet before the ridge proper. There is a fissure there, vertical, low near the ground. Air comes out of it, warm air." Cora did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "You found it." Ruth looked at her. "Gerald used to walk that ridge," Cora said quietly. "He walked it every summer for 30 years. He always came back saying the same thing. He said the mountain was keeping something. He never told me what he meant. I thought he was being poetic." The wind outside reached a new register, something past ordinary, and into the language of weather that demands to be taken seriously. The stove popped again. Ruth stood up and added another log, her last concession to normal routine, and then she put on her coat again, which she had not yet taken off. Cora watched her. "Tomorrow morning," Ruth said. "First light. We go up together as far as your knees will allow, and then we see what we can do." Cora looked at the window at the sky that was fully dark now, with something more than night. "How long?" she said. "Before it hits." Ruth looked at the weather radio on the counter, which she had turned on when she came inside and which was cycling through its loop in the flat mechanical voice of a system that delivered information without apology. She had been listening to it while Cora spoke. She had heard the numbers. "By tomorrow evening," she said. Cora picked up her darning again. Her needle resumed its small, precise arcs. Her hands did not shake. "Then we had better sleep," she said. They were moving before the light was fully up. Ruth had been awake since 4, lying in the dark, listening to the wind work on the house, cataloging its sounds, the way she had once cataloged a patient's symptoms. The high note at the northeast corner where the caulking had gone, the low, sustained moan under the eaves on the west side, the irregular percussion of the storm door. She had forgotten to latch and now could not reach without going outside. She got up at 5 and dressed in everything she owned that was warm. She did not make coffee. The propane tank on the south wall of the house was down to its last quarter, and she was saving it for what she could not yet name. Cora was already in the kitchen when Ruth came out of the bedroom. She was sitting in her chair with both coats on and her hat on her head, and her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a woman who has decided something and is waiting for the decision to be acted upon. She looked at Ruth when Ruth came in, and she nodded once, and Ruth nodded back, and that was the entire conversation about whether they were doing this. They went out the back door into a world that had hardened overnight. The temperature had dropped below 0 while they slept. Ruth knew this before she looked at the thermometer because she knew what below 0 felt like on the face. The way the cold stopped being a sensation and became a fact. Something the body registered not as feeling but as information. -4 degrees. The sky was fully overcast, a ceiling of gray so uniform it had no texture, and the light that came through it was the flat, diffuse light of a day that had never quite decided to begin. The snow under their boots was hard as packed sand. That was good. It meant the slope would be easier to navigate than the day before, the surface firm enough to hold their weight, rather than swallowing each step to the knee. Ruth had the canvas bag on her back with the emergency kit and the axe in her right hand and Cora's elbow in her left, and they moved together toward the base of the mountain with the careful synchrony of two people who have been moving through the same spaces for long enough that their bodies know how to accommodate each other. Cora's knees were bad. This was not a new problem, but a chronic one, the result of 40 years of walking on a mountain, and the particular punishment that mountain walking delivered to the joints of women who had done it without complaint for longer than was probably wise. She did not say anything about the pain. Ruth watched her face and measured the degree of it by the set of her jaw and the slight forward lean that Cora adopted when the incline increased, redistributing her weight in the small, unconscious way of a body that has learned to manage itself. They went slowly. Slowly was what they had. The slope rose gradually for the first stretch, and the hard snow was a mercy, each step finding purchase and holding it. Ruth kept them on the most gradual line, angling across the face of the mountain, rather than climbing directly, adding distance in exchange for a gentler grade. Cora kept pace without speaking. Above them, the pines stood in their winter silence, dark shapes against the pale sky, the upper branches moving slightly in the wind that did not yet reach the ground. After 40 minutes, they reached the base of the granite outcrop where Ruth had rested the day before. She looked up the slope to the cliff face above, reading the terrain the way she read it every time, automatically, out of long habit. The rock face was perhaps 200 yards further up and slightly east. Another 20 minutes on this surface, maybe 30 for Cora. "How are your knees?" Ruth said. Cora looked up the slope. "They have been worse," she said. They kept climbing. The granite cliff came into view from below as a long gray wall, perhaps 30 feet high, where it reached its maximum elevation before the ridge proper began. Ruth had always found something reassuring in its permanence, the way it stood at the edge of the property, like a boundary marker placed by something older than any human claim. She had walked its length many times in summer, trailing her hand along the stone, finding the particular pleasure of cold rock against warm fingers on a July afternoon. Today she was not looking for pleasure. She was looking for the place she had found the day before. She found it. The fissure was low in the rock face, almost at the base where the stone met the frozen ground, a vertical crack, perhaps 3 feet tall, and the width of a hand at its widest point. In the flat morning light, it was easy to miss just another shadow in the seams of an old rock face. But Ruth had marked its position in her memory, the way she marked the position of everything that mattered precisely and permanently, and she went to it without hesitation, and crouched down and placed her bare palm against the stone beside it. The warmth was still there, fainter in the morning cold, or perhaps she was colder herself, but present. The stone refusing the temperature it should have held. The air from the gap when she brought her face close, still carrying that deep mineral smell, that underground quality, the breath of a place that had nothing to do with surface weather. Cora had followed her to the base of the cliff. She stood a few feet back, watching Ruth with her hands folded in front of her, her breath coming in steady clouds. Ruth looked up at her. "Feel this," Ruth said. Cora stepped forward and pressed her gloved hand against the rock beside Ruth's bare one. She held it there for a long moment. Her face did not change, but something in it settled the way a face settles when it has been waiting a long time for confirmation of something it already believed. "August found it from below," Cora said. "He said the opening was small enough that you could walk past it 100 times and never see it." Ruth stood up and looked at the fissure and then at the ground around it. The debris of decades had accumulated at the base of the cliff. Loose rock fallen from above wind-driven soil, frozen into the lower cracks, roots from the scrubby brush that grew along the cliff face, pushing into every available gap. The opening itself was partially choked with this debris, a century of accumulation narrowing what had once been wider. She took the axe from her hand and turned it so the flat back faced the rock, and she began to work. She worked the way she had worked at everything in her life, which was methodically and without drama. She cleared the loose debris first, pulling away frozen soil and small rocks by hand, exposing the lower edge of the fissure, feeling along it with her fingers for the depth of it. The crack ran straight and deep. Not a surface fracture, but a genuine separation in the stone. The kind that geologists would have a word for that Ruth did not know. She used the axe handle as a lever against the larger rocks wedged into the lower opening, working them loose with steady pressure. And when the handle was not enough, she used her hands. Cora sat on a flat rock nearby. Her job, she had said when they started, was to remember. She had been the memory of this enterprise from the beginning, the keeper of the story that had made this possible. And now she served that function by simply being present, by holding in her 82-year-old body the thread that connected this morning to the winter of 1918 and to the woman named Ida, who had kept a story alive across 4 generations, because she had understood that the right story told to the right person at the right time was worth more than any amount of practical preparation. Ruth had been working for perhaps an hour when she heard the footsteps. She straightened and turned and saw Silas Pruitt coming down the slope above her, picking his way through the snow with the careful, unhurried gait of a man who had been moving on this mountain in winter for 50 years. He was 70 years old and built like a man who had spent those years outdoors compact and weathered his face under the brim of his hat, the deep reddish brown of long sun exposure. Even in winter, he carried a rifle across his back and a canvas pack at his hip. And when he saw Ruth standing at the base of the cliff with an axe in her hand and Cora sitting on a rock nearby, his face went through several expressions in quick succession and settled on the one that Ruth recognized as the expression people wore when they had decided someone needed to be saved from themselves. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the half-cleared fissure in the rock. He looked at the axe in Ruth's hand. He looked at the sky, which had darkened perceptibly in the last hour, the ceiling lowering the quality of the light, shifting towards something that had weight in it. He said, "What in the name of God are you doing?" Ruth said, "What it looks like." He studied the fissure. He looked at Cora. He looked back at Ruth with the expression of a man revising his initial assessment and not finding the revision more reassuring. He said that storm is coming down tonight, maybe sooner. You need to be inside a real structure, Ruth, not playing in a rock pile on the side of a mountain. My cabin is 3 miles up, but it is tight and warm, and I have enough wood laid in for 2 weeks. Ruth looked at him. She said, "Thank you, Silas." He waited. She turned back to the fissure and resumed working. She heard him exhale behind her, a long, controlled breath, the sound of a man who had made a reasonable offer and watched it refused, and was now recalibrating what it meant to be responsible for people who did not want to be responsible for. He said, "I cannot make you come with me." "No," Ruth said. "You cannot." There was a silence. Then she heard him moving, not leaving, but coming closer, and she felt him crouch down beside her and look into the fissure. He held his bare hand near the opening. She saw the moment he felt the warmth, the small, involuntary stillness that crossed his body. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "What is that?" Ruth said, "The mountain breathing." He sat with this for a moment. Then he straightened and unslung his pack and opened it. He set beside Ruth on the frozen ground a cloth-wrapped parcel that was heavy and dense venison by the smell of it, smoked and dried. Beside it he placed a small tin of rendered lard and a folded bundle of dry matches in a waterproof case. He said, "For your journey, then." He said it the way people say things when they mean something else by it, when the words are carrying more weight than their surface suggests. He meant it as a provision for dying for the journey that came after. Ruth understood this and did not argue with it. He looked at Cora, who had been sitting on her rock throughout this exchange, with the particular stillness of a woman who has seen enough of the world that other people's doubt no longer requires her attention. "Cora," he said. "Silas," she said, as though they were passing each other at a church social. He shook his head once, a small, private gesture, and then he shouldered his rifle and turned and walked back up the mountain. Ruth watched him go, his figure moving steadily through the snow, until the angle of the slope took him out of sight. She felt the small, familiar sting of being left, which was different from being alone and which she had felt before in her life. And then she turned back to the fissure and kept working. The morning deepened toward noon. The sky continued its slow descent. The temperature had not risen with the daylight, as it sometimes did, which Ruth noted and filed without comment. She worked steadily, stopping every 20 minutes to flex her fingers back to full sensation, to take a few sips of water from the thermos she had brought, to check on Cora, who had moved from the rock to a position closer to the cliff where she could watch the work more directly. The fissure was widening. This was not a matter of breaking rock, which Ruth could not have done with a hand axe, but of clearing what had accumulated in the gap over decades, the compacted debris that had narrowed an original opening into something barely passable. The stone itself, once cleared, was honest about its dimensions. The vertical crack was wider than the surface debris had suggested. Wide enough, once the lower section was fully cleared, for a person to pass through sideways with some difficulty. The depth of it was harder to assess without entering it. Ruth cleared debris for another hour. Her hands were raw through the gloves, and her back had begun to register the hours of crouching in the cold with the particular eloquence of a 64-year-old, back that has been doing farm work for 30 years and has not run out of opinions about it. She did not stop. Cora had been watching in silence, but now, she said, the opening August found was about the width of a man with his coat on. He had to turn and push through with one arm leading. Ruth measured the cleared fissure with her eyes. It was not that wide yet. She went back to work. At some point in the early afternoon, when the sky had completed its descent to something that was no longer overcast, but actively threatening the quality of the air, changed. Ruth had lived in Montana long enough to know this change, the way the wind drops just before a serious storm, the world going briefly and deceptively still, a pause that was not peace, but preparation. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees in what felt like minutes. She looked at the fissure. It was as wide as she was going to get it with what she had. She looked at Cora. She said, "I need to go in first and see what is there." Cora nodded. She had already begun moving toward the cliff face, her hand finding the stone wall for support. Ruth turned sideways to the fissure and led with her left shoulder, pushing into the gap. The rock was close on both sides, pressing against her chest and back, and she moved forward through it the way she had once moved through a crowded hospital corridor, her body knowing instinctively how to make itself smaller without losing its forward momentum. Her feet found purchase on the rock floor of the gap, which was rough and uneven but solid. The fissure was perhaps 4 feet deep before it opened. And then it opened. Ruth stepped into the chamber and stood in the dark and breathed. The space was not large, perhaps 20 feet across at its widest, the ceiling varying from 6 feet at the edges to perhaps 10 feet near the center, where the rock had fractured along a natural fault and shifted slightly upward. The floor was uneven but manageable, a mix of flat granite and packed earth. The walls were solid stone, cold to the touch at the surface, but without the deep bone cold of exposed rock in winter. Somewhere at the back of the chamber, she could hear the faint sound of water, a slow seep running along the base of the far wall. But what she felt before she saw any of this was the warmth. It was not the warmth of a fire or a furnace, not the sharp directional warmth of a heat source. It was something more diffuse, more fundamental, a warmth that came from the stone itself, and from the floor, and from the air, that moved almost imperceptibly through the space, from some gap she could not yet locate. It raised the temperature in the chamber perhaps 15 or 20 degrees above the outside air, not warm by any ordinary measure. But in the context of -4 and a storm coming down from Canada, it was the difference between survivable and unsurvivable. She stood in the dark and felt the warmth on her face and thought of Gerald saying this land is keeping something. And for the first time since she had begun this day, she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, which was too large a word, but the possibility of hope. The door that hope comes through when it decides to arrive. She went back out through the fissure and looked at Cora. She said, "It is real. It is what August found. We can live in there." Cora looked at her for a moment with those clear, familiar eyes. Then she said, "I know. They brought in what they had. The canvas pack from Ruth's back. Silas's venison and lard. The axe. The emergency kit. The thermos. Between 2 trips through the fissure, they brought in everything that could be brought in. And Ruth noted without sentiment that it was not much, a small pile on the floor of the chamber that represented the entirety of what 2 women had available to them in a world that was about to become very serious about the cold. The last thing Ruth brought in was the wooden sled that Gerald had built 15 years ago for hauling firewood from the pile to the house. She had dragged it up the mountain on the way in, tied to her back, with the parachute cord, reasoning even then that wood in some form would be necessary. The sled was pine hand-shaped, the wood dry and well-seasoned. It was their past. She was going to burn it. She began building a hearth. The chamber had a natural feature that Cora had described in August's account without knowing what it was. A narrow vertical fissure in the back wall higher up a chimney fault that ran upward through the stone. Ruth found it by holding a burning match near every crack in the upper walls, until she saw the flame pull sideways, drawn toward the one place where air was being drawn up and out. The fissure was too narrow to see into, but wide enough to serve its function. She built the hearth directly beneath it. Flat stones from the floor of the chamber arranged into a U-shape, the open end facing the room. A base of small, flat rocks to hold the fire off the earth. She worked by the light of the single candle from the emergency kit, her shadow large and moving on the walls. Cora organized what they had brought in. She found a natural ledge in the rock wall at shoulder height and arranged their supplies on it. The venison, the lard, the remaining food from the pack. She arranged them with care, with the particular domestic precision of a woman who understood that how you keep your provisions is an expression of your intention to be there long enough to use them. It was not tidiness. It was a declaration. The fire came slowly. The tinder from the emergency kit caught on the second attempt. A small yellow flame that Ruth fed with slivers of the sled wood. Then larger slivers, then pieces. She had split away from the sled's flat surface with the axe. The wood was good. It caught cleanly. When the fire was established, she laid a full-board section across the stones of the hearth and felt the heat begin to press outward into the chamber. The smoke rose and was drawn into the fissure above. The chimney worked. Ruth sat back on her heels and watched the fire for a moment and felt the warmth of it combine with the ground warmth of the chamber and become something that was for the first time in many days enough. Outside, the storm arrived. She heard it before she felt it. A change in the pressure of the air in the chamber. A subtle shift that told her body the outside world had made a decision. Then the sound came through the rock, muffled, but present the voice of a serious wind finding the mountain and beginning to argue with it. She could feel it in the stone, a vibration so low it was less a sound than a sensation. The mountain registering what was happening on its surface. In the chamber, the candle flame bent slightly toward the back wall, and then steadied. They were inside. The next 3 days were the smallest and the largest of Ruth's life. Small because the world had contracted to 20 feet of stone in every direction. To 2 women and a fire, and a dwindling supply of sled wood, to the sounds of the mountain and the distant weather, and the faint music of water moving somewhere in the dark rock. Large because in that contracted space, with nowhere else to be and nothing else to manage, the things that had been waiting for years to be spoken finally had room to arrive. They melted snow from the entrance passage for water, scooping it in the cooking pot and holding it over the fire, drinking it warm because warm water was warmer than cold water. And every calorie of warmth was a resource to be used. They ate sparingly the venison cut into small portions, the beans and potatoes from the pack, rationed across the days. Ruth's calculations, revised now for the reality of the chamber's ground warmth, said they could stretch what they had. The first evening, Cora spoke about Gerald, not about his death, which they had both spoken about enough in the past year in the necessary, but exhausting vocabulary of grief. About his childhood, the specific texture of it, the boy he had been on this same mountain before Ruth had ever appeared in the story. She spoke about a boy who spent hours alone at the base of the granite ridge, pressing his hands against the stone, who told his mother when he was 12 years old that the mountain was listening to him, and who never stopped believing this, even when he grew into a man. And the world told him in various ways that grown men did not speak like that. Ruth listened and understood for the first time what he had meant. Not metaphor, not poetry. He had known about the warmth in the stone. He had felt it as a boy and had spent 30 years walking that ridge, trying to find the precise place where it expressed itself. He had known there was something to find. He had not found it. He had left it for her. On the second day, Ruth spoke about the years of nursing. She had not intended to. She had sat down after the morning's work of tending the fire and maintaining the entrance passage clear of the snow that the wind pushed in around the edges, and she had begun speaking before she fully knew she was going to. She talked about the drives to Harlow in the dark winter mornings when the road was ice, and the heater in the truck took 20 minutes to catch up with the cold, and she drove with her shoulders up around her ears listening to the radio. She talked about the particular smell of the county hospital in the early morning before the day shift arrived, when the building held only its nighttime sounds. She talked about Gerald at home managing without her, feeding himself and the animals in the house and never complaining about the hours she kept. She talked about the things she had not been present for because she was present somewhere else. A birthday, a fence line that needed walking, the evening conversations that she understood now in the firelit silence of the mountain had been the real sustenance of their life together. The ordinary exchanges that accumulate into something worth more than the sum of their parts. She talked about coming home to find him already asleep, his large, steady breathing filling the bedroom, and standing in the doorway listening to it. The way she listened to rivers, Cora did not offer consolation or resolution. She sat with what Ruth said and held it in the same way that good nurses hold what patients tell them, not to fix it or interpret it, but simply to witness it. This was Cora's particular gift. Ruth had not fully understood this until now. On the second night, when the fire was low and they were lying under their blankets on the earthen bed they had made against the south wall. Ruth said into the dark, "I almost wrote to Vernon." Cora was quiet. "I sat at the desk the night he came." Ruth said, "I had the pen. I had the paper. I almost did it." Cora said, "I know." Ruth said, "How did you know?" "Because I almost told you to," Cora said. "I almost said, take the money, it is not worth your life. But I thought about what Gerald believed about this land, and I could not make myself say it." They lay in the dark, listening to the mountain carrying the storm on its surface, feeling the warmth from the stone beneath them. Ruth said he knew about the warmth. "Yes," Cora said. "He spent 30 years looking for it." "Yes." "And he never found it," Ruth said. Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He found you. He brought you here. He knew you would look where he had not thought to look. I believe that. I believed it the night you came in and told me to tell you the story again." Ruth lay in the dark with this. On the third morning, she was tending the fire, when her hand went into the bag for another piece of wood and found beneath the last boards of the sled something she had not put there. A tin box. It was the size of a hardcover book, the kind of tin that had once held crackers or tea with a lid that fit tightly enough that it had not rusted despite its age. Someone had wrapped it additionally in oilcloth tied with kitchen twine and placed it in the bottom of the canvas bag under the wood. Gerald's bag. She had taken it from the hook by the back door the morning they left. She had not examined its contents. She had grabbed it because it was the largest bag available, and she had needed to carry things. She sat down on the stone floor with the tin box in her lap. Her hands were not steady as she undid the twine and peeled back the oilcloth. The lid required pressure to open the seal firm with time and careful closing. She worked it free and looked inside. Papers, a folded envelope, a small notebook. And beneath these official documents, the kind with county seals and typed text, and signatures at the bottom. She took out the folded envelope first. It was addressed in Gerald's handwriting, which she would have recognized anywhere, the particular forward lean of it, the way he crossed his lowercase t with a short, deliberate stroke. He had written her name on it. Just her name, the way he had written it on birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen table, the way he had written it on everything he had ever addressed to her in 31 years of being her husband. Ruth. She held the envelope for a long time without opening it. Then she opened it. The note inside was short. Gerald had not been a man of many written words. He had expressed himself in the things he built, and the land he tended, and the steady constancy of his daily presence, and writing had always felt to him like an inadequate translation of what he wanted to say. But he had written this. He said that he had found the gap in the cliff face the summer of 2019. He had felt the warmth and understood what it meant, though it had taken him another year of reading and 2 conversations with a geologist in Harlow to understand the mechanics of it. He had discovered that the warmth came from a geothermal feature, a deep thermal gradient beneath the property that expressed itself through the fissure system in the granite. He had discovered that this was connected to the aquifer beneath the valley floor, a warm water table that no one had yet exploited. He had filed a claim with the county assessor's office in February of 2021. A legal document establishing Ruth's ownership rights to the geothermal resource and the water access associated with it. The document was in the tin box. He had put the box in the bottom of the canvas pack and hung the pack on the hook by the back door, because he had known that if anything happened to him and Vernon came for the land, Ruth would need to leave quickly. and would need to take what mattered. He had known she would take the pack, because she always took the pack. He had trusted her without telling her. He was trusting her the way he did everything quietly and with complete conviction. There was one more line at the bottom of the note. I could not find the opening in the rock. I know it is there. I know you will find it. I have always known what you are capable of better than you have known it yourself. Below that, just his name. Gerald. Ruth sat on the floor of the mountain chamber with her husband's letter in her hands and the fire burning low beside her. And outside, very faintly now, the diminishing sound of a storm that was passing. And she did something she had not done in the 12 months since Gerald had died. She wept. Not the controlled grief of a practical woman managing a loss. Not the exhausted tears of someone who has been holding too much for too long. She wept the way you weep when you have been loved more carefully and more completely than you knew when the evidence of that love presents itself in a form so specific and so patient that the only possible response is to let the body do what the heart requires. Cora sat down beside her on the floor. She did not speak. She put her arm around Ruth's shoulders and held her with the particular strength of an old woman who has outlived much grief and knows how to be present in the middle of someone else's. They sat like that for a long time, on the floor of the mountain in the warmth that had been waiting for them. The silence woke her. Ruth had grown accustomed over 3 days to the voice of the storm working on the mountain above them. It had been constant enough to become a kind of background the way traffic sounds become invisible to city people noticed only in its absence. She lay in the dark on the earthen bed and understood before she was fully awake that the voice had stopped. The fire had burned to coals. She could see their orange glow in the dark, pulsing faintly with the slow breath of the chamber. The warmth of the stone beneath her was unchanged, patient, and impersonal. And unchanged, the mountain continuing its ancient business regardless of what happened on its surface. She sat up carefully. Beside her, Cora was breathing in the deep, regular rhythm of old sleep. Ruth did not wake her. She added the last 2 pieces of sledwood to the coals and waited for them to catch, watching the light build back in the chamber. And then she put on her coat and hat and gloves and moved toward the entrance passage. The fissure was partially blocked. Snow had been pushed in around the edges by the wind during the storm, packing into the lower section of the passage until perhaps 18 inches of the opening was filled. Ruth had known this was possible. She had planned for it in the way she planned for everything, not with specific action, but with the mental acknowledgement that it would need to be addressed, that it was a problem with a solution, and the solution required work. She got on her hands and knees and began moving the snow back into the chamber, compacting it against the wall to the left of the passage. The work was cold and awkward, her body at an angle in the narrow space, her arms reaching ahead of her to scoop and pull. It took her 40 minutes. When she finally pushed through the cleared passage and emerged on the other side, she was breathing hard, and her coat was wet from the waist down. She stood up outside and looked at the world. The storm had remade everything. What she saw was not the mountain she had lived on for 31 years. It was a new country, a landscape from which everything familiar had been removed and replaced with its essential geometry. Every line simplified to its most basic form. Every surface resolved to a single material. The snow was deep and still, and the sky above it was the bright, hard blue of the day, after the specific blue that came only when a system of that magnitude had pushed through and taken the clouds with it, and left behind an emptiness that the winter sun could fill without competition. The trees were monuments. The granite cliff above her was a wall, its face clean and pale, the stone showing through where the wind had scoured it. Her breath came out in a plume of white that hung in the still air longer than usual, the cold so complete and dry that moisture did not dissipate, but simply waited. She turned to look down the mountain. The valley below was a white plain, all its features buried. She could trace the line of the creek bed by the slight depression in the snow, a shallow trough running through the white, the only feature the land still offered. The roof of her house was visible from here, a dark rectangle against the white, and she could see that it had held the steep pitch, doing what steep pitches are designed to do, shedding the load rather than accumulating it. She turned her eyes toward the slope to the east, toward the bench of land where Vernon Holt's operation stood. She had to look for longer than she expected before she understood what she was seeing. Vernon's main house had been a structure he had spoken of with a particular pride. A timber frame building he had contracted out to a crew from Missoula 8 years ago. The kind of construction that used heavy dimensional lumber and engineered fasteners and cost more per square foot than most people in the valley earned in a month. He had told Ruth the summer it was finished that it had been designed to last 200 years. He had said this without apparent irony. What she was looking at now was the footprint of a foundation, and above it a collapse of timber and snow. The heavy roof structure having failed at some point in the middle of 3 days of loading by a storm that had not consulted Vernon's engineers. The walls had held in places, but the roof was down a jagged, irregular depression. In the white, the angles of the broken rafters showing through where the snow had not yet covered them. Ruth stood on the mountain and looked at this for a long time. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not triumph, which was too hot and too small for what the moment required. Not satisfaction, though there was something in the vicinity of satisfaction. Something quieter and more durable. What she felt was closer to the feeling she had after delivering difficult news to a family. The sense that the truth had finally arrived, and that arrival, however painful, was better than its absence. The mountain had not done this to punish Vernon Holt. The mountain had not done this at all in any intentional sense. The storm had loaded the roof beyond its capacity, and the roof had failed, which was the honest mechanical consequence of a structure that had been designed to impress rather than to endure. Vernon had confused the appearance of strength with the thing itself. This was not a new error. It was one of the oldest errors available to human beings. She went back inside for Cora. Cora came out through the fissure with less difficulty than Ruth had anticipated, her knees registering the passage with a tightness in her face that was not complaint but simply the body's honest report. She stood outside the cliff face in the brilliant cold morning and looked at the valley and at the sky and drew a long breath of winter air with the expression of a woman who has been underground for 3 days and finds the surface world more interesting than she remembered it. Ruth pointed toward the eastern bench without speaking. Cora looked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His father built the original house on that property with his own hands in 1951. Vernon tore it down and built that thing." She looked a moment longer. Ida used to say that what a man builds tells you what he believes in. They stood together in the snow outside their mountain for a while, in the cold, brilliant silence of the aftermath. And then Ruth said, "Silas." She said it the way she said things when a decision had been made and was not available for reconsideration. The tone she had used as a charge nurse when the next action was clear, and the time for discussion was behind them. Silas was 3 miles up the mountain. His cabin was small and low, and had a steep roof, because Silas was a man who had built what he needed rather than what he wanted to show people. But he was 70 years old, and he had been alone in there for 3 days. and she did not know what the storm had done to the approaches to his door. Cora said, "I will tend the fire and wait." Ruth looked at her. Cora's expression said what it always said when she had made a decision, which was that the decision was not a negotiation. Ruth nodded. She made sure Cora was back inside with the fire rebuilt before she set out up the mountain. The 3 miles to Silas Pruitt's cabin took her 4 hours. This was not because of the distance, but because of what the storm had done to the terrain between here and there. The snow was deep and uneven. The surface crusted in some places and powdery in others, unpredictable in the way of new snow, before it had been traveled and settled. Ruth moved carefully, testing each step using the axe handle as a staff, reading the surface the way she read patience, looking for the signs that told the truth beneath the appearance. She fell twice. Both times she got up and kept moving. The forest above the cliff was different from the forest below it. Older and darker and more deliberate in the way old-growth timber carries itself. The pines here were massive, their trunks wider than Ruth's arm span, their canopies so dense that even in winter they held the snow above the ground, creating wells of relative openness around their roots. Ruth moved through these wells, where she could grateful for the old trees and their particular mercy. She thought about Gerald as she walked. Not with the grief she had carried for a year, but with something else. Something that had changed in the 3 days in the chamber. She had been carrying his absence as a weight, a thing she moved through the world with and around which the world had to arrange itself. What she was carrying now felt different. His absence was still there, but it had been joined by his presence specific, and documented the presence of a man who had spent 2 years preparing a gift that would only make sense if the recipient went looking in the right place at the right time. He had trusted her to go looking. She was going to have to figure out what to do with a trust that large. Silas Pruitt's cabin appeared through the trees as a dark shape against the snow, its lines lower and more horizontal than she had remembered, which meant the snow was deep against its walls. The steep metal roof had done its work, the snow sliding cleanly off the pitch and accumulating in 2 long ridges on either side of the structure, rather than loading the roof itself. The cabin was sound, but against the front door where the snow from the roof had slid and been supplemented by the drifting of 3 days of serious wind, there was a wall of packed snow, perhaps 5 feet high and perhaps 8 feet wide, solid and dense, the kind of accumulation that did not yield to a single person pushing from the inside. Ruth stood and looked at this wall for a moment. She could hear nothing from inside the cabin. No sound of movement, no voice. The stovepipe above the roof showed a thin thread of smoke, which meant the fire was alive, which meant Silas was alive, which meant she had 4 hours of hard walking behind her. For a reason. She started digging. She did not have a shovel. She had the axe in her hands and the parachute cord, and 30 years of improvising with available materials. She used the flat of the axe blade as a scoop, working the packed snow loose and throwing it to the side, and where the axe was too wide for the angle, she used her gloved hands. She worked from the top down, rather than the bottom up, which was the correct approach for packed snow, and the one that her nursing instincts had identified immediately, because it was the approach that gave her access to the problem, rather than burying herself in it. She had been working for perhaps 30 minutes when she heard a sound from the other side of the door. A voice, muffled by the snow and the wood between them, but present a human voice, the particular quality of a sound made by a person who has not spoken to anyone in 3 days and is not certain their voice still works. Ruth kept digging and said loudly, "Silas, it is Ruth Callahan. I am coming." The sound from the other side changed character. She could not make out words, but the tone shifted from inquiry to something more urgent. a person remobilizing after a period of stillness. She heard movement on the other side of the door, the creak of floorboards under weight. She dug for another 20 minutes. When the door finally swung inward, the light from inside the cabin fell across the snow, and Silas Pruitt stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression that Ruth had seen before, only on the faces of patients coming out of sedation. The particular bewilderment of a person whose understanding of their situation has just been significantly revised. He was wearing everything he owned by the look of it. Coat over coat over coat, his face shadowed with 3 days of beard. His eyes moving over her face, and then over the cut passage through the snow behind her, and then back to her face. He said her name. She said, "Can you walk?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then come out of there. You can rest later." He came out. He was stiff and moved with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body had been cold for too long and was not entirely reporting accurately yet. Ruth assessed him the way she assessed patients, quickly and without ceremony, his color acceptable, his movement controlled if slow, his eyes tracking. He was going to be fine. He had been cold and alone and frightened, which were manageable conditions in a person who was fundamentally intact. He said, "How did you get here?" She said, "I walked." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Then he said, "I watched you from the ridge, you know. The day before the storm. I watched you at the rock face with your axe and your mother-in-law sitting on a rock, like you were in a garden. I thought you had lost your reason." Ruth said, "I know what you thought." He looked down the mountain in the direction she had come from. He said, "Are you telling me you are alive because of a hole in a rock?" She said, "I am telling you I am alive because my husband spent 2 years preparing for a situation he did not expect to survive." Silas looked at her for a long time in the cold, brilliant light. Then he said, "I have some coffee that is probably still warm if we go inside." She said, "We need to go down to the valley when you are ready." He nodded and went back inside and came out 10 minutes later with his pack and his rifle and his snowshoes and the particular readiness of a man who had spent 50 years on a mountain and knew how to make himself prepared to move. They went down together, Ruth leading on the packed trail she had broken, coming up, Silas following in her tracks. He was better on snowshoes than she was in boots, and after the first mile he moved up beside her, and they went the rest of the way side by side, which felt correct, which felt like what it was, 2 people who had been given a second chance at the same time and were making use of it together. Cora had the fire built up and water boiling when they came in through the fissure. She looked at Silas with the expression she reserved for things she had expected, and found exactly where she had expected to find them. She handed him a cup of hot water with some dried venison dissolved in it, which was not coffee but was hot and salty and was precisely what a man who had been cold for 3 days needed. He drank it without comment and sat near the fire and looked around at the chamber with the careful attention of a man who is revising his understanding of things. He said, "August Weaver." Cora looked at him. He said, "I heard that story when I was young. My grandmother knew a woman who knew his daughter. She said he found a warm place in the mountain and saved his family in the winter of 1918. He said, I thought it was a story people told, the kind that gets bigger every time it is told." Cora said it was a true story. Ida kept it true. Silas sat with his cup and looked at the fire. After a while, he said, "The whole county is going to hear about this." Ruth said, "Not yet." She said it quietly, but with the particular weight she could put into 2 words when she needed them to carry more than 2 words could usually manage, and Silas looked at her and nodded. There was something she needed to do first. They stayed in the chamber 2 more nights, the 3 of them, while the snow settled and the surface hardened, and the route down to the valley became passable. Silas contributed his considerable knowledge of winter travel and terrain reading to the practical questions of their situation, and his presence shifted the dynamic in ways that Ruth had not anticipated. He was a man who had spent 50 years learning from the mountain rather than arguing with it, and he understood what the chamber represented without needing it explained. On the second evening, he said to Ruth, "The county assessor filed those thermal rights last year. I know because my neighbor Carl Briggs wanted to develop a hot spring on his property and was told the adjacent claim had priority. He said he never knew who owned the adjacent claim." Ruth looked at the tin box that she kept now in her coat pocket close to her chest, the way she had kept Gerald's things since the morning she found it. She said Gerald filed it in 2021. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vernon Holt has been making inquiries about that development project since the spring. I heard it from 3 different people. He was trying to find the owner of the adjacent claim so he could buy it out." Ruth said he already knew who owned it. Silas looked at her. She said he has been trying to get this land for 11 years. He came to me the week before the avalanche with a number written on a piece of paper. She paused. $200. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then he said a geothermal development in this valley with senior water rights attached would be worth several $1,000,000 to the right investor. Ruth looked at the fire. She said Gerald knew. She thought about the note in the box, the specificity of the instructions, the oilcloth wrapping the placement, in the one bag she would certainly take if she had to leave quickly, the deliberateness of a man who had understood that the information he carried would need to survive his absence, and who had engineered its survival with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything he built. He had known Vernon would come for the land. He had known Ruth would need evidence that the land was worth keeping. He had known, with the particular faith of a man who had lived beside his wife for 31 years, that she would do whatever was necessary to keep what was theirs. What she had not understood until she stood in the chamber with his letter in her hands was that he had also known she might not feel that it was worth keeping. He had known the exhaustion that waited for her on the other side of his death. He had known that a woman alone on a mountain in winter with a number on a piece of paper, and a road that would not open until spring might reach a moment of deciding that the land was not worth her life. He had put the answer in the bag she would take when she left. If she was leaving anyway, she would find what he had prepared, and finding it would tell her that there was a reason to stay. Ruth had worked with dying people for 30 years. She had seen the preparations they made when they understood that time was limited. She had seen people write letters, organize finances, contact estranged family members. She had seen some of these preparations done from fear, and some from love. And she knew the difference immediately and completely, the way you know certain things in the body rather than the mind. What Gerald had done was love expressed in the language of a practical man, which was the language of preparation of tools, placed where hands would reach for them, of problems anticipated and solutions positioned. She had spent a year mourning his absence. She was going to spend the rest of her life in the presence of what he had left. On the morning of the 5th day after the storm, Ruth came out of the mountain. The valley had settled into the quiet of post-storm winter. The landscape simplified, and still the light hard and clear and shadowless. She could see the full extent of what had happened, the scope of it, the way the storm had moved through the valley and rearranged its priorities. Her house stood. The barn had lost a section of roof on the north side. The small structure she used for tool storage was buried to its eaves. The creek ran dark and unfrozen through the white valley floor, the only moving thing visible from the mountain. A line of dark water that neither froze nor ran dry, exactly as it had always been. She looked east toward Vernon's property. In the days since the storm, she had not thought much about Vernon Holt directly. She had been thinking about the tin box and the documents inside it, and about what came next, which was a question that required answers in a specific order. The first answer was that she and Cora were alive. The second was that the documents were real and valid and registered with the county. The third was that there was now to the extent that any of the old framing held something to protect. Vernon came 2 weeks later. The road into the valley opened in stages first, a narrow passage cut by a county plow, and then a wider clearing that allowed ordinary vehicles. Ruth heard the truck before she saw it. The engine sound distinct on a mountain where she had not heard engines in 3 weeks. She was in the house at the kitchen table with the documents from the tin box spread in front of her, and Ruth Calloway on the telephone, who was not a Calloway by marriage to anyone in this valley, but was the senior attorney in Harlow, and had been retained by Gerald and by Ruth, and whose opinion of the documents in the tin box Ruth had been waiting for. She said, "The claim is valid, Ruth. Filed February 11th, 2021, stamped and registered. The associated water rights are tied to the senior access agreement from 1947. She said whoever told you these rights were uncontested was either uninformed or was hoping you were." Ruth said, "And the debt." Ruth Calloway said, "What debt?" She said, "I have Gerald's estate documents in front of me. The property was clear of encumbrance at time of death." She said, "Whatever Vernon Holt told you about irregularities, I would want to see his documentation. Before I said it was anything more than a story someone told to make a widow." Feel like she had no options. Ruth thanked her and set down the phone as the truck came into the yard. Vernon Holt was a man who had survived a serious structural failure, and who was by the look of him when he came through the door, aware that this had altered his standing in some way he had not fully processed. He was wearing a coat Ruth had not seen before, a newer one which meant the good wool coat had been in the house when the roof came down. His face had the particular quality of a man who had spent several days in a cold outbuilding revising his understanding of his situation and had arrived at a version he could live with. He came into the kitchen the way he had always come into this kitchen, as though the space owed him access, and he stopped when he saw what was on the table. Ruth did not stand up. She looked at him and said, "Sit down, Vernon." He sat. He looked at the papers. He was a man accustomed to reading rooms, and the room was telling him something he had not expected. Ruth said Gerald filed a thermal rights claim in February of 2021. The claim is registered and valid. It covers the geothermal feature associated with the property and the water access connected to it. She said he did this because he knew what the resource was worth, and because he knew that you knew, and because he understood that the right thing to do was to make sure the ownership was on record before anything happened that might create confusion about who owned what. She placed the registered document on the table facing him. She said the development project you have been discussing with investors in Missoula since March will require access to this resource. She said, "I have been in touch with Ruth Calloway in Harlow, who represents this estate, and she is prepared to discuss the terms of any development conversation at the appropriate time." She let him look at the document for a moment. Then she said, "The debt you mentioned when you came here in December. The irregularities in the estate." She said Ruth Calloway has reviewed the estate documents and found no unresolved encumbrance. She said, "I would like to see your documentation." Vernon looked at the registered claim. He looked at the document from Ruth Calloway. He looked at the tin box sitting on the table beside Ruth's elbow, which she had placed there deliberately, which she had polished with a kitchen cloth before he arrived, which she wanted him to see. He said, "Where did you find that?" Ruth said, "Gerald left it for me." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was very still. Outside through the window, the valley lay in its white winter quiet, the creek running dark and clear through the snow. He said, "The house is gone." Ruth said, "I know." He looked at the table for a moment, and she saw something cross his face that was not the expression she had seen on him before. Not the calculation and the performance, but something older and smaller. Something that might have been in him before he became what he had become. He said, "I am staying in the equipment barn. It is not fit for winter." Ruth looked at him. She was a nurse. This was both the simplest and the most complicated thing she knew about herself. It was the organizing fact of how she moved through the world. You treated people's conditions, not their characters. You addressed what was in front of you, not what had come before it. She said, "There is a spare room in this house. It is cold and it has not been used in a year, but there is a bed in it. She said you can stay until you have made other arrangements on the understanding that we have a conversation about the property and the development question that is honest and documented." Vernon looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You survived the storm." She said yes. He said, "How?" She looked at the tin box on the table. She said, "Gerald left me what I needed. I just had to go find it." He sat with this for a moment. Then he nodded once, a different kind of nod, from the ones she had seen from him before, something that did not carry calculation in it. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. It was conducted with Ruth Calloway on speakerphone for the parts that required legal precision, and without her for the parts that required only two people who had known each other for 31 years to sit in the kitchen and speak honestly. By the end of it, the outlines of an arrangement had been established, preliminary and contingent on several things that would need to be verified and documented but honest. Vernon Holt was not a good man in any of the ways that mattered most, but he was not stupid, and he understood that the position he had spent 11 years trying to achieve through leverage was now available to him only through agreement, and that agreement required him to offer something real. He went to stay in the spare room. He was quiet and he ate what Ruth put in front of him, and he did not come into the kitchen unless he was invited. After a week, he began clearing the barn roof, which had sustained damage, without being asked. After 2 weeks, he hired a crew from Harlow to begin assessing the damage to his property, and did not mention the documents on the table or the conversation that had taken place. Silas Pruitt came down the mountain in the 3rd week after the storm and became a permanent feature of Ruth's kitchen, arriving most mornings before 8, with something from his trapline or his supply stores, and staying for coffee and conversation that ranged from the practical to the historical, depending on what Cora wanted to discuss, which was usually both at once. He never spoke about the morning he had left them at the cliff face, but he made himself useful in ways that had the quality of apology without its awkwardness. The way certain people settle debts through attention rather than words. Ruth did not return to the house as her primary dwelling. This was a decision she had not anticipated making, but which presented itself to her in the days after the storm as something that had already been decided and was simply waiting for her to acknowledge it. The chamber in the mountain had become something in those 3 days that a house could not easily become in 30 years. A place where she had been stripped to what she essentially was, and had found that what she essentially was could manage. She was not ready to give that back. She and Cora established the chamber as a second home, spending days there when the weather allowed building on it in the small incremental ways that structures built by women who intend to stay are built. A better hearth with fitted stones and a proper arch, shelving carved from a flat section of granite, a second entrance wider which Silas helped her open over 3 days in early February using proper tools, A door wooden hung on iron hinges that Silas brought down from his workshop that could be latched from either side. When the road fully opened in April, and the first people came up from Harlow with the spring, they came first out of the ordinary business of a thawing valley, and then as word moved through the community, the way word always moves in small places, out of something else. They had heard about the two women who had gone into the mountain during the worst storm in 40 years. They had heard about the chamber, the warmth the fire built under a natural chimney. They had heard about Silas Pruitt dug out by the people he had left for dead. They came to see the chamber the way people come to see things that challenge their understanding of what survival looks like, which is to say, they came with the particular combination of curiosity and respect that people bring to things they cannot entirely explain. Ruth showed them the chamber without ceremony. She showed them the hearth and the shelves and the earthen bed, and the fissure in the back wall where the warmth came through. She let them press their hands against the stone and feel what she had felt the first time, the warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight and everything to do with what the earth keeps in its deep places. Most of them said nothing for a moment after they felt it. They just stood with their hands against the stone and their faces doing the thing that faces do when something exceeds what they had prepared to understand. Cora sat in her chair near the hearth on the days visitors came and answered questions when she was asked them and did not answer them when she was not. She was the keeper of the story as she had always been, and she understood that the story was now large enough to keep itself, and that her job was simply to verify it when verification was needed. Ruth Calloway came up in May with documents that formalized the arrangements with the Development Consortium from Missoula. The terms were what Ruth had asked for, which were not generous in the ordinary sense but were honest. A long-term lease on the geothermal access, with specific protections for the land and the water, and the character of the valley. Vernon Holt received a share that was fair rather than large, and that he accepted without objection, because it was more than he would have received if he had continued the path he had been on. He had rebuilt on his property by summer, a smaller structure this time lower to the ground, with a roof that a local contractor had designed specifically for the snow loads of this altitude. Ruth did not ask about the design. She noticed the steep pitch of the roof and said nothing. Silas Pruitt became the person Ruth trusted most in the valley, which was a relationship that had begun in the most unpromising possible way and had become in the months following the storm something that felt like what the word neighbor was originally meant to describe. He knew the mountain and its moods as well as any living person, and he shared this knowledge freely and without the condescension that certain kinds of expertise sometimes carry. He and Cora had long conversations by the chamber fire about things that Ruth did not always follow, but was glad to hear the sound of two people who had been alive long enough to know what was worth talking about. In September, on a morning when the first suggestion of the coming winter had begun to appear in the quality of the light, Ruth sat at the entrance to the chamber, with the valley below her showing the gold and rust of the autumn aspens along the creek. She had the tin box in her lap open, the documents inside it already committed to memory, but present still their physical reality, a comfort she had not expected to depend on. She took out the note. She had read it more times than she could count, in the way you read things that say exactly what they need to say and nothing more, finding in the repetition, not redundancy but depth, something different in the words each time, depending on what you brought to them. Gerald's handwriting on the folded paper, his name at the bottom of the page. She read the last line. I could not find the opening in the rock. I know it is there. I know you will find it. I have always known what you are capable of better than you have known it yourself. Ruth folded the note and put it back in the box and closed the lid. The valley below was a painting of itself, all its colors at their most honest. The way living things go honest in the weeks before the cold. The creek ran its dark line through the middle of it, unfrozen and clear and permanent. The pines on the upper slopes were very still in the windless morning, their dark shapes a counterweight to all that gold. The wind came eventually. It always did. It found the entrance to the chamber and moved through it in the way it had moved through every crack and every surface on this mountain for longer than anyone living could calculate. And Ruth felt it on her face and heard it in the stone around her, and thought not for the first time, and not for the last, about what Gerald had meant when he said the land was keeping something. It had been keeping many things. It had been keeping the warmth in the stone for longer than anyone knew. The geothermal secret of the mountain, the particular gift that August Weaver had found in 1918, and that Ida had kept in the stories she told, and that Cora had carried across 8 decades, and that Ruth had found with cold hands on a cliff face in December. It had been keeping the documents in the tin box, faithful and dry in the oilcloth wrapping, waiting for the hands that would know what to do with them. It had been keeping the shape of the man who had walked this ridge for 30 years, and believed in it when the evidence for belief was thin. Ruth sat at the entrance to her mountain in the September light and felt the warmth behind her, and the cold season coming ahead, and the particular exact quality of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which she had not felt in a year, and which she understood now. She had not given herself permission to feel, because she had not believed she had earned it. The wind moved through the valley below and through the aspens along the creek, and made the gold leaves talk among themselves, and then was gone, leaving the morning to its silence. Ruth Callahan was 64 years old, and she was not finished. She sat in the entrance of the mountain her husband had loved and her mother-in-law had remembered, and she had opened with her own hands in a storm, and she looked out at the valley that was hers, that had always been hers, that had been waiting with a patience longer and deeper than any human grief for her to understand that it was worth keeping. She put the tin box back in her coat pocket close to her chest. She stayed there until the light moved and the cold came, and from inside the mountain she could hear Cora putting water on the fire, the small domestic sound of it carrying through the stone, the sound of someone who had made a home in a hard place and intended to stay there. She got up. She went inside.